Welcome to Understanding Islam. This is episode 12. This is series 3 when we're looking at building a just society. And today we're going to look at Muslims inviting others to the path of Islam. Remember that if you've missed any of these programs, you can always catch up on the on-demand section of the Ahlul Bayt website, and you can download an article to go with each of these programs from my own website. Picture the scene. Here lies a dying patient. The doctor stands looking at the patient, and in her bag she has got the medicine that can save the patient's life. What kind of a human being would she be if she didn't offer the medicine to the patient? Let's widen the picture a little bit. Here is humanity, struck with a terminal illness, and a group amongst them have the secret remedy. They have the means to cure the terminal illness. Surely they would want to share that with the whole of humanity, even if it meant radical change in the lives of some of those people so that they could save their lives, even if it meant some of them being uncomfortable. Maybe some of them would not want to hear the message. However, their responsibility would be to share that knowledge, to issue the invitation. This way lies the remedy for your illness. Come and take it. This is the thinking that lies behind Muslims seeking to invite people to the path of Islam. Let's just remind ourselves, what is this Islam that people are being invited to? This is, in Muslim understanding, the natural way for human life to be lived. It is therefore the birthright of every human being. It doesn't belong to a particular group of people called Muslims. It belongs to every human being by right. Therefore, no one has a right to deny it to other people. Everybody has a right to hear the message and a right to make their own choice. You decide, but you need to hear the invitation. You need to know what's on the table so that you can make your decision. This is the thinking that lies behind Muslims' invitation of others to the path of Islam. Islam understands that God has no favorites. God calls all humankind into a relationship with God, the natural relationship of the human being, one of total obedience to God. How are they to know? From the very beginning, God has been sending revelations and prophets to humankind to guide humankind on essentially the same project, the same message, how to live a fully human life. How to live a life that will bring you happiness in this world and paradise in the next world. And therefore, all humankind are invited to that message. Now, the last of those revelations is the Quran. The last of the chain of prophets is Prophet Muhammad. And therefore, Muslims, that community who follow and found their life on the guidance of the Quran and Prophet Muhammad, are the bearers of the final message. Therefore, they have a responsibility to share that with the rest of humankind, to all human beings without exception. That includes the followers of the earlier revelations. Because after all, if you think about it, in Islamic understanding, those people, if they were truly following their earlier prophets, they would recognize the truth of the Quran, the truth of Prophet Muhammad, and therefore they would become Muslims. Therefore, the invitation is wide open to everyone. It is theirs by right. Nobody can deny it. And yet the choice of whether or not you want to take it up belongs to each individual themselves. Nobody can force you to accept. In Arabic, to invite somebody, to issue an invitation, is dawah. And therefore dawah is the term used for inviting people to the way of Islam. And the person who does the inviting is the da'i. Now, invitation is the key word here. The Quran is explicit in saying there's no compulsion in matters of religion. You are free to make a choice. And the Quran is also aware that some people will decide that they want to walk another path. And the Quran then gives an attitude to Muslims in this situation. It says, to you your religion and to me my religion. So the individual who receives the dawah is free to examine it, to think about it, to choose, to ask questions, to explore, but then it needs to be that they are listening to the invitation of God. Are they being invited to become a Muslim or not? If they are, then it's up to them if they accept. So the Muslim in this sense is the agent, the one who issues the invitation, not the one who controls the process. And so after the invitation has been issued, that's job done. It's not the responsibility of the da'i, the one who invites, to determine the outcome. That's up to the individual concerned. If we look at the methodology to be adopted here, we see that there are several little episodes in the Quran that give good pointers for a way of going about the process of dawah. We're told that Moses and Aaron are to go to the Pharaoh to ask the Pharaoh to allow the Hebrew people to go free. And when they go, they are to speak with a soft voice. They are to speak in a way of respect, in a way that doesn't provoke aggression. They are to speak in a way that wins over the heart, the mind of the Pharaoh. So that is the first of our Quranic principles for the methodology of dawah. We read again and again in the Quran that we are to use our reason. We are to interrogate, to think things out, to ponder over things. The world is full of signs if only you will consider them. So the human being has the great dignity of being given the gift of reason, of intellect, to examine, to ask questions, to think about things, and also the freedom then to make a choice. So interrogation and the use of reason become a second part of the methodology. A third part is that the Quran is very clear in saying that ridicule should have no part to play in human relationships. Indeed, there is a verse of the Quran which tells us explicitly, do not abuse, do not ridicule the idols of the idol worshippers, for fear that they in turn will ridicule God. So ridicule has no part to play in it. Thirdly, we're told that Prophet Muhammad, in preparing himself to receive the word of the Quran, goes into periods of meditation and of purification before God to receive the weighty word of the Quran. Now, in this way, then, the Muslim who would make dawah is taught to go through an inner purification and inner preparation so that they can bear the task before God of inviting people to the way of Islam. The Prophet himself is taught that it is not because of him that people respond to the message and become Muslims. This is God's choice. It is God's call. The human being responds. And therefore there is no room for arrogance of somebody saying, "Oh, I've converted 24 people to the way of Islam." Nonsense. No human being ever converted anybody. This is God's invitation and God's call. And so the Quran counsels to humility and not to arrogance, to being the agent of God in dawah and not the one who thinks that they are in control. There is a key verse in the Quran that gives a methodology for dawah. It is chapter 16, verse 125. And it tells people to call unto the way of God, that is to make dawah, to invite, using 3 things: beautiful words, the best of arguments, and wisdom. Let's take beautiful words first of all. Beautiful words means not using harsh or aggressive language. It means using well-chosen phrases. It means not frightening people, but rather being with them in the best possible way to explain the message. Let me give you a couple of examples of how not to do it. I remember being in the middle of Birmingham in a great shopping area, pedestrian area, and all the people were going along on a Saturday afternoon, and there were 2 people standing up, literally nose to nose. One was a Muslim da'i, and one was a Christian evangelist, and they were bawling verses from their respective scriptures into each other's faces. You can imagine the impact that this had on people. They walked along the pedestrian area, separated in a great flow around the 2 people, saying, "If that's religion, I want none of it." Another example, same city, same kind of situation, and there is a Muslim who is issuing the invitation to Islam, mounted on a stepladder, with 2 minders standing at the foot of the stepladder, dark glasses, big boots, great big beards, looking really scary, his 2 minders. And you can imagine that he was haranguing the crowd, and the crowd wanted nothing to do with it. So the first methodology then, from 16:125, beautiful words. The second element of the methodology, use the best of arguments. There's no need and there's no room for dirty tricks. Sometimes we hear of people being cajoled into becoming Muslim. A woman who has fallen in love with a Muslim man and is told, "Oh, you've got to become a Muslim, his family will never accept it otherwise." Well, his family know better than God? So there should be no room then for dirty tricks, the best of arguments, says the Quran. Just in the same way, there are some people who like to make dawah making selective arguments. They choose verses from other people's scriptures and then they build arguments around them which are like fantasies, castles in their own mind. And they think that their argument is terribly convincing, but it's only convincing to themselves because they have built this fantasy world. And this does, of course, is to drive other people away from the message of Islam. So the best of arguments is the Quranic instruction here. And then the third part of the Quranic instruction, you are to use wisdom, to know what to say, to whom, and when, how much to say, on what occasion. Let me tell you another example, because obviously if you've been doing my work for the last few decades, I've been invited to become a Muslim hundreds of times over these years. So let me just tell you one example where a convert to Islam invited me to come along to the mosque one evening because he wanted to talk to me. And he wanted to explain to me, engage me in a dialogue, so that he could lay out and ask my opinion about all those reasons why he had converted to Islam. So of course along I went and we sat together, and this was a late night session. I arrived about 11 o'clock. We were sitting on the floor of the mosque, and he began. And he kept going. And he kept going for 1 hour, for 2 hours, for 3 hours, and it was 3 o'clock in the morning before I was allowed to get a word in. Now you can imagine this hadn't exactly left me in the best possible frame of mind to engage in dialogue. So maybe there was a shortage of wisdom there. So these three then form the basis of the Quranic methodology. Beautiful words, the best of arguments, and wisdom. As in all things to do with Islam, Prophet Muhammad serves as the best model for Muslim conduct. So then one can see the way in which he invited people to the way of Islam. The first thing was his hallmarks were the strength of his faith and conviction and his sincerity in the way that he lived his life. Sincerity is a very interesting word. It comes from two Latin words that mean without wax. Now, here's what used to happen. When you had statue makers or figure carvers who used to carve figures, if they made a mistake, they'd fill in the mistake with wax, and then they'd let it go hard and just shape it off, and then they could sell it. Nobody would know that it was filled in with wax. Until, of course, you got it home. And then you'd put it close to the fireplace, the wax would run out, and then you would see that it really wasn't what it pretended to be at all. So, without wax, sincere in his conviction and in his faith. This is the Prophet's first example. The second example, we're told that the Prophet was the living Quran. Everything he said, he did, the way he conducted his life was like the message of the Quran lived out in action. Now, we have a saying that actions speak louder than words. And so the best means of dawah, according to the prophetic model, is to live out the message every day and in every way, so that people are attracted to the way that you live rather than the way that you talk. There's a nice little story told about St. Francis of Assisi in the 13th century, who was sending out his missionaries, and he said to them, "You are to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ wherever you go. Use words only if you really have to. In other words, do it by your actions. Do it by the way that you live your life." Now, we can see a couple of examples from the life of the Prophet. The example when we're told he stood up as the funeral of a dead Jewish man was passing by, as a sign of respect for that person. As an action, a witness, not only to his own companions who were looking on, but also to the family of the Jewish man to see here was the Prophet standing in respect. as their dead relative was being taken to be buried. Again, we're told that there was a woman in the marketplace in Medina who used to hurl abuse at the Prophet and throw filth at him. One day she was ill, and he went to visit her, and she was so moved by his action, by his compassion. He said, "I missed you. I heard you were sick. I came to visit you." She said, "If that's the kind of man you are, if that's the kind of religion Islam is, I want to become a Muslim. I want to make my shahada straight away." So actions speak louder than words. If you remember back to the early days of the time of the Muslim community in Mecca, when they were living under persecution before the migration, the hijrah to Medina, the Muslim community never numbered more than a couple of hundred people, just a few hundred who were believers at that time. And yet the Prophet didn't give up. He persevered. There was always a way that he would keep going, trusting in God. We're told that the Prophet invited all manner of people to the way of Islam, both the rich and the poor, the powerful and the powerless, but he adapted his means of talking to them according to their station, if you like. So to some he would speak personally, and then we're told that he wrote letters to the leaders of the world at that time, inviting them to embrace the way of Islam. And then the Quran uses various terms to speak about the Prophet. He was a witness to the truth. He was a bringer of good news, news that would liberate people from the mess that their lives were in. He was a warner. He was one who would be quite clear about saying what are the consequences of not following, of not taking the medicine of Islam. He was a summoner. He was one who called people to embrace Islam. And finally, he was a guiding lamp. The way that he lived his life was like a beacon in the darkness, pointing the way for other people to follow. Various means are used to make dawah, to invite people to the way of Islam. Traditionally, of course, this was always done in person by word of mouth. But since printing has come along, there have been lots of books and pamphlets, leaflets that have been printed by people in order to spread the message. And some pious Muslims will give money to pay for the cost of printing this kind of material so that they can share in the work of dawah. In the electronic age, we've seen rapid developments in this field, from audio tapes to videotapes to DVDs. Sometimes these are talks, sometimes they're structured presentations, and sometimes they are debates. Now, the thing about debating is it depends who sets the rules. Some of these debates, we can see, are actually set up in such a way to make sure that the Muslim debater wins, because they set the rules. So we have to remember the instruction, the best of arguments. There's no room for dirty tricks in the business of dawah. Of course, the latest electronic development is the internet. And since the coming of the internet, we now find that there are literally thousands of sites around the world in various languages that are making dawah, that are reaching out to people. One of the problems is that there is no control about what comes onto internet sites. And so anybody can set themselves up as some sort of expert in dawah on the internet. Indeed, it's quite possible that somebody with a fairly small amount of money, with enough technical know-how, and with plenty of time, could actually run half a dozen websites, all purveying the same kind of message. Now, the same kind of message is quite important here, because often what happens with these internet websites is that they are not giving a rounded, balanced picture of Islam, but instead they're tending to push one particular interpretation of Islam as though that were the only interpretation that is within the Muslim community. And so we lack balanced, informative sites, and we have plenty and plenty of sites that are coming from one particular perspective and trying to push that to unsuspecting people. It's very difficult for people coming to the internet to know the difference between a good, solid, well-researched, well-thought-out, well-informed website and one which is pushing a particular party agenda. We need to help people to understand that there's very little that's neutral when it comes to the internet. And now let's end with a word to those who are on the receiving end of dawah. Because if one is going to engage with Muslims, with the Muslim community, if one is going to study Islam, this is a question that is bound to come up. It can come up through serious study and reflection. What is this saying to me? How am I reacting to this? It can come up through personal interaction with Muslims. Anybody who interacts with Muslims must expect that people will invite one to become a Muslim. How should you respond? Well, my advice is to say, this is a sign that people care about me. That people care that I should be guided to the right path, the path of happiness in this life and fulfillment in the life hereafter. And so I should always welcome that as a sign of people's caring. Secondly, this is a question that must be taken seriously. Who am I, who is anyone to say to God, "Oh God, you are not going to invite me"? This is God's invitation. And therefore, if people are going to take God seriously, then the invitation must be taken seriously. Thirdly, it's important to remember there is no compulsion in matters of religion. The Quran tells us very clearly. It is therefore possible that people should say, "I'm really sorry, having heard your request, having read this material, having thought about it, I decide in conscience before God, this is not the way for me to go. To you your religion, to me mine," the Quran says. And finally, it's very important to remember that on the day of judgment there is only one judge, and that is God. God who knows all, who knows the inner intention of the human being, who knows the inner disposition of the human being. And on that day all things will be made clear. There will be no place to hide. And on that day everyone will be accountable for their own deeds, their own actions, their own response, one way or another, to the calling of God. That concludes Series 3 of Understanding Islam. Keep an eye on the schedules on Ahlul Bayt Television for Series 4, the last series, which will be starting shortly.